Opposing Gloves here, and today we're going to talk about high ratios. I'm going to try and do this in one video. It is very similar to low ratios and mid ratios. It's much more similar to mids, but mids are, we took our information from lows to understand mids. So it's again, high harmonics are just generates different frequencies. So we're going to talk about serial, parallel, and single modulator relationships. First, let's approach feedback. So the most simple one is when you have an oscillator feedback into itself. So here's one. Feedbacks into itself, we get a saw wave. No news there. So what if we, let's make it a triangle wave. Let's see if it's a saw wave. What if we make it a high ratio against itself? So really high, like a mid, well, here's a mid. And let's get a view of the spectrum. So, okay. I am going to tell you, these, when you get up there, aliasing will become a factor of your sound design. I turned oversampling on to reduce aliasing because you'll just get a crap ton of noise. So I left aliasing on. If I turn aliasing, I left oversampling on. If I turn it off, you see we get a very different sound. We see that and if you go back to our sideband equation from the sideband video, this makes some sense. Yeah, and this in-between stuff has now become outrageous, so I'm going to turn oversampling on. See, just a little bit gets rid of it. If we turn it up to 32, it goes away nearly completely. So this is quite heavy on your processing, though. So let's talk about what's going on here. We see that our things get spread out further and further and further, and they're obeying the laws that we're familiar with the particular ways they modulate between things, and they happen to produce different timbres, different amounts of noise because there's different quantization that's happening, which is something you should be more familiar with from the digital audio series. So as we get higher up, because our coefficients, our sidebands, they'll get farther apart because it's just a higher frequency. So they'll move out of the spectrum much quicker, and as a result, we'll get them way far out there. If we want to introduce some mid bands, we could modulate. So that's feedback. Let's go back to, well, let's show you the square wave. So, okay, so we get high. I'm going to talk, when I say anything above like 16 to me is a high ratio. So let's go back now let's talk about something else. So we know that it's in ratios of 2. So if we want things to be harmonically related, we're going to move in this ratio. We're going to go half that ratio or double that ratio. We go 2 to 4. 3 will have some sort of a relationship. If we go 4 to 8, we know that 6 will have some sort of in-between relationship. So those things will be related to our fundamental, and as a result, they will appear more musical when we're trying to compose with them in the staff. You could, in the piano roll, you could always try and finagle the pitch around until it works with whatever you're working with, but sometimes discerning pitch from this can get a little tricky, especially with higher ratios. So let's turn on operator 2 and modulate 1 by it. And let's make 1 just 1. All right. So if we come up here to like 40, as you can see, our harmonics get very dense in little pockets because of those sideband rules I just told you about. And I've got a high harmonic in this signal. Let me get rid of that. Okay. Now if I bring it down, which is fine. This makes sense with our mid bands. This should be pretty intuitive what's happening right now, based on the fact that you've watched all my previous videos. So when we get higher up, we get these dense packs. Well, how can we influence that to get some stuff in between? Well, we can use our knowledge of high frequencies. We can add a few high frequencies, and now we're going to get side bands that fall. They're not quite so big, so we're gonna see them sort of spread out a little bit. If we put our harmonic closer to our fundamental, and another way, as you can see, they don't spread too far apart. Another way to help us do this is if we modulate our modulator by another wave. Let's make this a low-level sine wave. And we could do something like this. We could see our sine wave in there. That top one looks cool. And let's increase it a little bit. So you can start to see where this could become sort of a dangerous thing. So you see, combining high and low ratios gives us quite the options. Very interesting. So, okay. So that's some elementary high band stuff. I know I didn't really get bands too much in the middle. If you really want bands in the middle, if that didn't do it for you, another option you have is you could just do something in parallel. Take 3, for example, bring it up. And you can try moving them around like that. And because in parallel, we discussed from our low frequency, our low ratio video, how that just increases the bands. As you can see, they sum quite differently though, because the amount of spectrum that's generated from a high frequency thing is just huge. So that's one reason why I would like to be able to EQ my stages individually. I could EQ out parts of the spectrum and then send that to become the new modulator. That would be so powerful. Like that would I've not seen a plugin that does that. If someone knows of a plugin that does that, you should let me know. That would just be outrageous. Like, so cool. So freaking cool. Okay, so that's high ratios in serial and in parallel. If we do a high ratio against another high ratio, we end up just getting... So 2 is at 32, 3 is at 64. That's pretty... I wonder if oversampling will change that. Oh, will. Wow. So, as you can see, oversampling plays a big role. A plugin like FM8 does not have oversampling. Let's open up FM8 and do some of this in there. So, here I've got FM8, and we're going to go to the Expert tab. So, here's F coming out. I'm going to modulate F by E. I'm going to make E a... I have a whole series on FM8 if you've never used FM8. I'm going to make the ratio high. You can type in a value on FM8. One of the coolest freaking things ever. We're going to make it 20 or 64. All right. That's on A. This one. And on these things, you can modulate these. In Citrus, you can't. So you can do something like that if that's your desire. On F, let's take it up. Let's make it a saw wave, a triangle wave. At this point, I mean, I do not have that much. I don't have that much to tell you by way of this. The high harmonics are pretty much what you expect them to be. They just tend to bunch up, and they're very, very, very touchy. You could find... You could find a relationship that works and one that just doesn't quite work. You just get a whole bunch of interesting things, but you get ballpark sort of what you're going for. Now you can tell we're going to get high, really high content and stuff like this. So what about things like in Citrus, where we add a high harmonic to our already high ratio? Well, let's say that we've got a low, so this is ratio 1, and we add a high harmonic. Let's make this not so obnoxious. Another tone essentially just gets introduced. If we take it lower, I'm playing really low notes right now. You might be thinking that these timbres are not that great, but these are actually super mega useful timbres for all sorts of instruments. Just got to turn the envelopes on and off correctly, which we will be talking about shortly. So let's take and reduce our modulation index. see we can add high harmonics to our modulated signal, and that will give us some upper frequency content. Or we could come to our modulator and add content, and we can select parts of the spectrum to hit. So we can, instead of hitting over there, maybe we want to hit like closer to the fundamental. You see it sort of merges up now. Or we could go over here. This is out of the spectrum, and I've oversampled it out. If I turn my oversampling off, there it is, because it's aliasing back in. So this is also a big point. When you have stuff like this, these things can ruin your sound if you're not careful, because it'll render at ×8, and then all of a sudden your sound will sound totally different than what you had it at. So we are pretty much done with ratios. If you have any questions about anything about ratios, let me know. Experiment, of course, just you experimenting will give you very useful things. We're going to talk about in the next video turning these things on and off with different, various options that we have available. If you have any cool examples of sounds you've made using just FM, drop them in the comments. Now, of course, you're probably adding in effects and stuff. I'm talking about just FM relationships. So if you're dropping stuff with like chorus and reverb, that's kind of like, that's a cheap shot. As we saw, some of those sounds are pretty easy to make, but it'd be kind of interesting to see what you come up with, with all your different variations. And you should have some idea of what you're touching and why you're touching it, and you could come up with some really neat stuff. If you have any questions, again, let me know, subscribe, and have a blessed day.